Hey, DCL podcast listeners, it's Steve. One of the things that this last year has definitely taught a lot of us that in life, sometimes you have to pivot. And nothing can be more true when you're trying to run a podcast that centers around Disney Cruise Line and travel when that has all become non-existent. But it has also allowed us here at the DCL podcast to kind of look at some of the projects that we've always wanted to do. They've been on the back burner. And today is a kickoff of a short series that we are going to do. I have enlisted a good friend of the show, Steve from Tampa. He kind of has a passion for looking at history such as I do. I will note that both of us are just amateur historians, and so if we get some of the facts wrong, or if any of you out there knows something different than what we're talking about or what we do talk about in these upcoming episodes, we'd love to hear it from you because we want to make sure we get the right information out there. But most of the stuff that we're talking about are going to come from different articles and a book that I read a couple years ago, actually right after our first cruise back in 2015, that kind of detailed the rise of the cruise industry. And so we're going to kick off this short series. We're going to call it Cruising into History. And we're kicking off the first one taking a look back at Gorda Cay. Well, Gorda Cay, we all know that today as AKA Castaway Cay. This history of Gorda Cay that we're going to talk about came from an article in Outside Magazine published in 2004. I will put the link in the show notes so you can go there, but if you don't want to deal with the link and go into the show notes, just Google Outside Magazine Gorda Cay and this article will come up so you can read it for yourself. But I hope you're going to enjoy this series. It will be in addition to our regular weekly episodes, so watch for it. We're going to probably have about one a month and should run through the spring. And once again, it's called Cruising Through History. So without any further ado, let's kick off a look back at Gorda Cay as we begin our cruise through history. Enjoy, everyone. Well, welcome back to the DCL podcast, your podcast to help you and your family cruise a little smarter when the ships are sailing. And this is going to be a little bit different episode, to be completely honest. I would like to welcome back to the show our amateur historian all the way down in the Tampa area. How you doing tonight, Steve?
I'm okay, Steve. How are you?
Not too bad. Well, you know, you kind of brought up this idea to talk about the history of Castaway Cay, a.k.a. Gorda Cay. Am I saying it right?
Gorda Cay.
Gorda Cay. And you kind of did a deep dive into the history of it, didn't you?
I did. I went down this hole. I'm happy to share, hopefully, what is somewhat of a coherent story and some history. Yeah, I think it's quite interesting.
So I have to honestly say that neither one of us are true historians. We're kind of amateur historians, and so you did a lot of this research through some different sources. We are not experts. If some of this stuff is wrong and somebody knows something differently, please reach out to us and let us know, and we will try and correct it in the future. But, we are doing this from the best that we can from the sources that we used.
Yeah. And it is, if you do go down this and you want to do some research on your own, you find some stuff to add to it, please share it, because it's actually really hard to pull stuff in any archive that feels like it has integrity that tells the story. But what's fun about it is there are some good details, and then there's some folklore and things that you can kind of fill in the blanks with what's going on there.
So let's just start it from when did you first go to Castaway Cay, Steve?
So actually in 2001.
Okay.
Yeah, we were on the Wonder and we did like the land and sea. My stepsister's 7 years younger than I am, I believe, 8 years younger than I am. So she was like ripe age to go on a Disney trip. I was too cool for school at 19 at that point. But it was such an awesome trip. Yeah. So we were there in 2001. I don't personally remember it at all at that point. I really don't.
Well, we didn't make it there till 2018. So, it'd been quite a while between now and then. But, the thing about the Caribbean and the history of the Caribbean is there's just so many angles to it. So many players that traversed those waters during the different centuries. And I think you're right. Probably trying to really track down and really nail the history of the Caribbean is a really tough thing to do, because you get different angles depending upon who was writing the history or even talking about the history. Mm-hmm. And so here we are today.
Yeah, especially with Gorda Cay, with Castaway, right? Because it was relatively undeveloped for so long, up until about the mid 1960s, which we'll get into a little bit. So it's really hard to piece together everything. But I was really interested in it.
Okay, well, let's just jump into it. We'll give a little background on Castaway Cay itself with Disney. The Disney company purchased a 99-year lease in 1997 from the Bahamian government. And they spent $25 million over 18 months to construct Castaway Cay. Obviously, they've put a lot more money into it since then. And the thing that I found interesting was it was actually the first cruise private island that allowed, because they dredged up the pier and dredged up the bottom of the ocean to be able to build that pier. They were the first private island to allow cruise ships to dock at, so you didn't have to tender.
Yep, I think they were very much keen on not having to tender into the private island, which is why they spent so much time and money developing it. But it was also really interesting. When I say so much time, it's only 18 months from the point they get that lease to when they start to have guests on the island.
Yeah, so they did that pretty quickly, which I don't want to go down the rabbit hole of Lighthouse Point, but it's probably going to take them quite a bit longer than 18 months to develop that area now, probably for a lot of different reasons, being respectful of, not that they weren't respectful on Castaway Cay, but being even more so respectful on Lighthouse Point because of, as we moved, 20 some years into the future, things just move differently as far as environmental protections and everything else.
Absolutely. Yeah. I actually was thinking about a follow-up to find out some more information about just history and stuff of Lighthouse Point. I'll be curious to see how long it's going to take to develop it. Obviously, with all the delays in COVID and so on, I'm sure it's going to take even longer to put together.
So one of the things that our family had a chance to do was parasail last time we were there, which was just about a year ago. Mm-hmm. And you brought up the point that how much of Castaway Cay is actually developed?
Sorry, I'm looking down at notes as we talk, but about 55 acres of it are actually being used. So the acre itself, which was formerly uninhabited, is a 1,000-acre island, but only 55 acres are actually developed. And I think that's part of the conditions of the lease as well. They have 2 sewage plants, I think, on the island as well, and about 60 people that live on Castaway year-round, give or take here and there. And then when it started, it was about 40, but I believe they expanded out to about 60 cast members that live out there on the island, especially as the larger ships have come in and perhaps there's more guests to accommodate.
So it's a pretty small portion of the island that's actually developed that we as tourists or as guests of Disney Cruise Line get to actually experience. And you could really see that when we were up parasailing. And if you ever get a chance to do it, I highly recommend it. It was a lot of fun. Make sure I didn't bring my camera up, unfortunately, to get some great shots of the ship, but you could really see how big the island was once you got up there and were being pulled along. And that's when I realized, and as you just stated, that it's just such a small portion of the island that's actually been developed.
Yeah, and so it actually gets its name, Gorda, which is fat. It gets its name because of how wide that actual key is. Generally speaking, most of the keys are very long and narrow, and that happens to be quite wide. So if you can get a drone photo, or if you look at Google Maps and you see the terrain, you can see the western part of Castaway's developed. It's very small by comparison to how much of it is completely undeveloped.
So where is Castaway Cay? We kind of get on the ships and we go float around the Caribbean and whatnot. And then that last night or the first night you end up at Castaway Cay, or last or first day you end up at Castaway Cay. And it's actually basically just due east of Fort Lauderdale, right off the island of Great Abaco. And it's north of Nassau in the Bahamas. Yeah,
it's 225 nautical miles south of Port Canaveral. And it's about 160 miles south of Miami as well, to give a point of reference. When I looked that up, I guess I kind of knew how close it was. I just didn't know it was that close. I'm about 75 miles from Disney World, so it's about double the trip from that we have to Disney over from Miami to Castaway. It just feels like, of course, you're in a completely different place if you've had the privilege to go there. So, but it's quite close.
So the other thing that we'll get into eventually here, but the other thing that kind of makes it stand out, and the reason why they have it or still maintain it, is when you run the 5K, you run around kind of this cool area that goes around through the jungle, and there's a lookout point, which I've never actually gone up to be able to see it. There's like a tower, but then you come out of the jungle and then you go up and down the runway. Mm-hmm. The runway's there now because if somebody gets hurt, whether they're a cast member that's there during the week when the ships aren't there, or somebody else, somebody else gets hurt there, that's a lifeline to get people off the island, but it's also a lifeline to bring supplies to the island.
Yes, and that is That's where you've chosen to take myself and a couple of your closest friends on a trip to land in Castaway, as there's no guests allowed right now, right, Steve? Sorry.
Exactly. Well, I'm looking it up. They do have an ICAO code. So like you're in Tampa, your code is KTPA, and everybody goes to Orlando. They all know KMCO, which is short for McClellan Field. It was McClellan Field, which used to be a SAC base for the Air Force. But Gordo Key or Castaway Keys is Mike Yankee X-Ray Bravo. So we could potentially put a flight plan in and go out there.
Right. As far as I looked up, there haven't been any flights that have landed there in a long time. I was actually curious if it was active in any way for delivery of supplies, emergency evacuation. I think those records would be public. I don't really know. You might know more than I do. But yeah, I kind of envision that maybe there was some use, but I guess not. I guess they're getting all their supplies and people are getting on and off the island via the cruise ships.
Well, that's where the majority of them are. Well, let's jump into the history of it. So, and we can't go too far back, but where do you want to start, Steve?
I do think, well, let me just add a couple more things that I felt like maybe were a bit interesting. They used about, in development of the island, there was about 50,000 truckloads of sand that they had to use to develop the island. I guess they have 3 beaches, if you think about it, right? It's Serenity Bay, the family beach, and then you have the beach that buoys up on the Cabanas as well. Oh, and the maiden voyage, the first trip to Castaway. So the Magic left on July 30th, 1998, and the Navigator has them in at Castaway on August 2nd, 1998. It's the first time they saw guests and the cruise line dock there.
And that would be interesting if anybody's out there that actually went on their first voyage and would like to come on and talk about it. We'd love to hear it.
Right? Wouldn't that be cool? I just before we started and I saw that date, I was thinking, there's got to be some folks out there, maybe some longtime people that were on that maiden voyage on the Magic and were the first guests at Castaway. It's really neat. The other thing that I thought about adding, which I thought was really interesting, was at the time. So when Disney was doing this planning, why they were so gung ho about it, 92% of American public had never cruised at that point. So it was a huge open market, and what they found out is that over half of cruise line bookings were first-time cruisers. So Disney changed the game in that they pulled people into a market that hadn't cruised previously. You know, I know the other ships and other cruise companies are competitors, some of them more direct competitors in their, I guess like Royal would be a direct competitor with Disney. But in a lot of ways, they created new cruisers, which I think was probably welcomed by the industry. They brought them in and maybe in some ways stepped up the game. So I thought that was fascinating that the brand was able to bring in a number of first-time cruisers at that point.
Yeah, definitely. There's a great book I think it's called Devils on the Deep Blue Sea, which I got, which really gives you the background of the cruising industry. And if anybody's really interested in doing that, I think you can still get it on Amazon. I've got a copy of it, and it's one of those things that I really want to do a history, kind of go back and do like a history episode a little bit like we're doing here on. It doesn't have any Disney mention in it really, because it's really talking about the start of Norwegian and Royal Caribbean and whatnot. But it's really fascinating how the whole cruise industry started. And what, like you said, what was it? 92% of the people hadn't cruised at that point, or was it 90?
It said 92% of the American public had never taken a cruise when Disney was starting to create the cruise line.
Yeah, and I think it's still pretty low today, to be completely honest. I mean, compared to other things that people do. So,
oh yeah, anecdotally, I just have a number of people who won't even go with us because they're just, I guess there's a fear thing with getting on a cruise ship, or maybe a perception or perspective of what cruises actually are and so on. And I have people that in our lives that just won't go and don't understand why we do it. But
I know. And we keep going back and back, right?
Exactly. And I'm like, yeah, it's the best and easiest family vacation. I mean, I was talking to a couple last night where they were like, we're not Disney people. I was like, let me get you on Disney Cruise Line, then we'll talk. But anyway, whole nother episode.
So just looking at Gordo, I'm butchering the name for some, Gordo Key. It's kind of really situated in between a lot of different places. So it's kind of an isolated place by itself, but yet easily accessible from a lot of different land masses, which I think lends itself to what happened there.
in the late 60s on into the 70s. But let's go a little bit before then. Let's start a little bit earlier than that.
So if you take a look at it on the map, you see it's a part of it's kind of in the pathway of where major trade routes were in the 16th century. Particularly with the Spanish, there was documented cases of people even finding like Spanish treasure in the 1950s when they were traveling through the Caribbean. It was a respite for rough waters. It was a place at one point that people had farmed because of the rich soil. It's a very wide key relative to the other keys. It had a different soil that was conducive to growing crops as opposed to some of the other surrounding keys. So it became part of a major stop in a trade route. Of course, again, it's suspected that literally pirates had stopped at this island in its history. Certainly, European colonizers had stopped there. And originally, Abaco and Castaway were populated by the Lucayan people, or the indigenous folks who had lived in that area. So again, I think just its location, what it offered as far as the soil and the ability for people from Abaco to come over on their boat and actually grow crops there and fish, and a respite for rough waters for a lot of fishermen throughout its time. There's not a lot of documented history, beyond that in those centuries. But I think when you fast forward up to the 20th century, the mid 20th century, is where you start to get a little bit more of a rich history and how it got into Disney's hands. Again, fascinating stuff.
So in about the 1960s, and this is kind of we're going to kind of go through a little bit of an article that was an Outside magazine.
Yeah, so I'll give you a little background. So I stumbled upon this article, and I was really trying to. There's a lot of nothing against blogs or anything, but there's a lot of Walt Disney blogs and history of Castaway Cay and so on. And I really was trying to get sources of history. Like I almost thought I was going to come in here like there would be like a Bohemian library and archive where I'd get all this rich history, which to my knowledge does not exist, but hopefully somebody else can help us. But there's an article by Robert Antoni in Outside Magazine. It was written in 1999. He goes on a Disney cruise, and apparently his grandfather Alvin Tucker bought this island in the 1960s. His grandfather was Alvin Tucker, and he was a descendant of English planters and French Huguenots who'd gone to Trinidad in the late 18th century. So his dad lives in Trinidad. His grandfather lives in Trinidad. He apparently becomes wealthy, where he runs his own oil refinery. And then he was among the first Trinidadians. Alvin Tucker is among the first Trinidadians to own a single-engine plane. And then in the late 1950s, he made his initial trip to the Bahamas, when, with the exception of Nassau, the capital, a country of a few isolated villages for all of its 700 islands. And so effectively, he takes out this single-engine plane, does like a flyover, an audit, and sees Gorda Cay, and like falls in love with it with just an aerial view. At the time, there was no, of course, landing strip. It was only accessible by boat. So he goes out and purchases it again in the mid 1960s. And because he had a plane, he goes and develops a landing strip so he can travel to the island, to and from the island. And so the gentleman who writes this article talks about actually visiting this place as a kid. So that's where I'm like, we got to get this guy on and find Robert Antoni and talk about it. So he, where his family actually has ownership of this island. He talks a little bit about his grandfather, talks a little bit about visiting the island, but I think it's more salacious history is as we get further into the 1970s. But as he owns it, he visits it frequently. It's also open to the Abaconians, I believe I'm pronouncing that correctly, Abaconians and the villagers. So it's not a contemptuous relationship. Though it's privately owned, the villagers still come over, use the land, are able to frequent it. It's not a dangerous place. It's not a place that's armed. It's not a place that's militant, apparently. It seems somewhat of a cohesive, peaceful place. I think from what it sounds like, he had plans to develop it into what I'm not exactly sure, but of course, as you see, he they have the landing strip there and so on. But he never gets the chance to do that. Sorry, go ahead, Steve.
No, so it kind of reminds me of Larry Ellis, the founder of, now I'm totally drawing a blank. He's big, huge tech company, Oracle. Sorry. So the founder of Oracle, he's actually bought the island of Lanai over in the Hawaiian Islands.
Okay.
And it's always fascinated me because there's actually towns and people that live and before he bought it actually owned property on Lanai, but now he actually owns the island. So I was always kind of curious, like how does that whole relationship work? So it sounds kind of similar as far as, with Alvin and the Abaconian people, where, he owns the island, but then they are still using it to farm and to however they were using it before he bought it.
Yeah, so he says here, Gorda Key was deserted when we first visited the island as children, except for a few farmers from Abaco who spent part of the year there, and my grandfather's caretaker, Bob Adderley. A Bohemian fisherman with dark skin and transparent blue eyes, he claimed as one of the first forebears an Irish sea captain, was the only permanent resident of the Key. So Bob Adderley lays claim to the only permanent resident there at the Key. So again, really interesting. So you have an absolutely pristine piece of land, just there, pretty much deserted up until the 1960s. A stopover for years, a place for villagers from Abaco, but not a place that was highly sought after, looked to be developed. And so I just found that really fascinating.
So we get into later in the 60s. Am I saying that right? As far as the time frame goes, and things start to change.
Mm-hmm. So we'll fast forward a little bit. So effectively, the way I understand this, and I'm trying to piece this together kind of eloquently, is its geography is its enemy. Its geographic location becomes a little bit of its enemy. So it's so close to Florida, particularly very close to Miami, and it's described here. And there's a little bit of the of that kind of folklore that Pablo Escobar, frequented the island, but effectively it becomes this dangerous place for drug smuggling.
And why is that?
So its location. So what would happen, which I understand, is these barges would come from Colombia full of drugs and would drop off supply on the island. Now, people are frequenting there that don't own the island, that aren't necessarily permitted to be on the island, that Mr. Tucker has no knowledge necessarily of what exactly is going on. Remember, he's not a full-time resident of the island. And he effectively starts kind of hearing these rumors that they're smuggling narcotics that are going to be bound for Florida. So, marijuana, cocaine, and quaaludes actually start coming through Gorda Key, what we now know as Castaway Key. And so that's a huge part of its legacy now. And effectively, Alvin, as I understand it again, he starts to understand even the villagers in Abaco who could go there, or anybody that normally stopped there. Now the island is filled with Dobermans and armed guards. So it's basically a hostile takeover, and there's no means to actually stop this from happening. There's no Bohemian government or military or anybody that's able to stop this from actually happening. And I believe there is one article here that he references. By 1980, Little Gorda Key had made the big time, at least in terms of notoriety, appearing in the headlines of the Nassau Tribune. Although drug smuggling was written all over the story, the words remained unmentioned. Foreigners take over Gorda Key. So his grandfather actually was able to sell the island to a shell company called Leisure Club Ltd.
Does he talk about in this article why his grandfather did it? Was it because this takeover, he there was no way out with it, so maybe it was just time to get rid of it? Does he talk about that at all? Yeah,
so he effectively says that there's machine guns on the island that he owns, and it might be a little risky to go there now. So it was effectively just a hostile takeover, and says it's just too dangerous to visit. So where maybe it became utilized in some capacity here and there for a stopover for supply, it then became like a full-time operation for it. And they had, again, like Dobermans and armed guard on the island, which is fascinating.
And to kind of put it into perspective, this is what, the late 60s on into the 70s then?
Yeah, so when this article in the Nassau Tribune was written, it was 1980, but by the mid to late 70s is when all the drug smuggling really happened.
And we know that Crockett and Tubbs from Miami Vice were not around to really put a dent in the drug smuggling until the 80s. So that is probably a good reason why he decided to sell it as well.
Yeah. Yep. Exactly.
Because if Crockett and Tubbs were there, they would have shut this whole thing down.
Yes. Exactly.
And I'm aging myself right now. If nobody knows what that is, you can Google Miami Vice and see some really bad outfits from the 80s. I digress. Yeah. Sorry, Steve.
No, that's great. Don Johnson. What a guy. Yeah. So this is when, that period of time, like I was telling you before, a little bit before we started recording. I mean, if you've seen like some documentaries, if you know, of course, you have the escalation of the war on drugs. You have the ascension of Pablo Escobar, the drug cartels, and all the business that was being done through and basically run through South Florida, which was a major point of where the operation started to when cocaine was coming into America hand over fist. You very likely those folks that were partaking in that had at one point stopped over at Gorda Key and became the where the drugs were then dispensed and dispersed to Miami. So again, I think that's quite fascinating. Lasted about, the way it looks like, it lasted a little less than a decade of that happening.
Let's go back to that because you started down that route and I kind of cut you off. But so Alvin finally decides to sell it, but he sells it to kind of a shell company corporation that is kind of fronting this island at that point, right?
Yeah, there's an American kind of mastermind behind it when they purchased the island, a gentleman called Frank Barber. So you can look him up. That whole story is really interesting as well. He lived, it says here, he was known as the Big Boss. He's an American who lived in a ranch-style house in Delray Beach, Florida, with a compound large enough to land his twin engine. This is your Cessna. Are you familiar with this plane? Did I pronounce that correctly?
Yep.
In the backyard. He'd been one of the many using the airstrip on Gorda Key, in quotes, without permission for years, and now own the island. He began his drug running activities in earnest. Now, so he's behind the transfer. So he starts using it before he owned the island. And it became a number of different cartels that would actually use that island. He wanted full control over the operation. And now, I'm not even going to infer how that would work. I don't know if it was just like particular cartel that would only operate there, or if he was charging people, or however it worked. But so now he's getting full control. Frank Barber's fate would not be too kind at that point. Let's see. So the first arrest, the first seizure of at Gorda Key was in 1977, and you had $30 million worth of marijuana discovered in 2 yachts anchored in Pumpkin Harbor. The police found Barber on the island not long after the passenger seats of his plane removed. And the last bust was in 1983, and that was when they had $100 million worth of cocaine 5 days before Barber went to jail. So I guess this operation was ongoing. He was already in trial, already set to go to jail, and they found another $100 million on Gorda Key. So it was known that they smuggled marijuana, cocaine, Quaaludes. He smuggled quantities on the order of what General Motors orders from U.S. Steel. And that's a quote from the judge. And it ends, he died soon after starting his 5-year sentence. And he never saw his ambitions for Gorda Key realized. Well, Frank Barber, if you were alive now, you would not believe what happened to your island.
Oh, for sure. So,
right?
So what happens next? Does it talk about, was it the U.S. government that really did this? Was it the Bahamian government that kind of shut it down? What happens to Gorda Key after that? Does it?
In that period of time, it's unclear to me when I look. I mean, from the mid 1980s to when Disney leases and develops the island, I believe it just goes into the hand of the Bahamian government at that point. And so I'm not sure what it was repurposed for. I'm not sure what was going on that island for that decade, but it doesn't sound like there's anything beyond what it was previously being used for. None of that was happening as far as I understand. So that's where like there's just a lot of parts in here where you kind of fill in the blanks, I think. And I don't know, and maybe you know, but I'm not sure how Disney, I believe they don't necessarily happened upon the island. I'm not sure how they, got to that point where they got that idea and how long it took from like, okay, this could be our location to let's lease the land. I'm imagining it didn't take them that long to get to that point, but
probably not. So we can speculate on that. I mean, we could definitely add some speculation into it. Obviously, you know, their first sailings, the majority of them were around the Bahamas with the Magic, and so having an island that's fairly close to Nassau to get everybody to make sense. So I'm sure that that's the main reason why they looked at that area. Plus, just with the idea of spending a day there and then bringing the ship back to Port Canaveral the next day, it all just kind of fits. You don't want to be in a situation where you're having to go a long distance to get to a private island like that. So it totally makes sense as to why they picked the Bahamas. But I thought it was interesting. Does the article conclude with Robert, the writer, actually visiting on a cruise?
Yeah, so it's actually, he talks about, as he starts the article, he actually goes on a cruise and visits this island, and he starts out, at 6:30 a.m. I stumble out into the small deck attached to our cabin. I stick my head into the soft salt breeze and rub my eyes. My wife and our 2-year-old son sleep curled up on the bunk bed behind me. He's on a Disney cruise. So he's writing for Outside Magazine to talk about Castaway to this island that he had visited as a kid. And he actually goes and he looks for the house that his grandfather had lived in when he frequented the island, and he stopped by an Australian cast member and another cast member from Germany. I guess it was right off the airstrip. There was a small home, I guess kind of a hut. I don't know if it's still there. I believe he sees parts of it when he's snooping around, but he's told that no, he can no longer, trespass here. So he finds it incredibly bizarre, as you might, to a place where he had ultimate reign and freedom to explore as a kid, to now it being like off limits all over the place for him, and such a small portion of it being open to the public. So it's really it's a fascinating article. I would love if someone would be able to get him on and talk to him. I think I think we should reach out. But so, could you imagine being able, of course, if you've been there, if you've just seen even pictures, could you imagine being a kid and this is like your grandfather's island? It's amazing. So yeah, he talks about, he doesn't necessarily have an opinion on Disney owning, but I think it's obviously like really weird for him, of course.
No, I find that totally fascinating as well. As kids, my dad grew up on a farm, and so we used to go to the farm up in Minnesota, as kids all the time in the summers. And my parents, after my grandfather passed away, my dad and his sister finally sold the land to somebody else. And we've been by it in the past. And it's just weird to drive by this property and look, and you can see like the old barn and everything else. And I remember as a kid, going all over the place with our BB guns and all that kind of stuff, and just having a great time. And now you can't go on it anymore. So I could imagine that, him growing up as a kid and visiting it, with his grandfather, and then being on a ship and seeing it again.
Absolutely. He even goes in here and goes as far as to try to talk to a couple of the Bohemian cast members that live there and work there. And he kind of tells them, like, my grandfather actually owned this place at one, what's it like being here and working, for Disney and stuff. So it's really, he says he connects here with this one cast member he calls Obie, O-B-I-E. And the guy almost kind of helps him look for where his grandfather's house would be on the island, and talks about what it's like living there. He says, the living accommodations are good with only 2 to a room. The dorm has air conditioning. The food is decent, though he's tired of hambija. Is that how you pronounce it? And macaroni pie, as he said. And he also comments that Obie has never heard of Alvin Tucker. So Alvin Tucker's legacy needs to live on here. And so we're trying to tell that story. It's when you look around, it's really hard to find a lot of what's going on. I think it's actually very fun, though, to imagine, pirates on this island, to imagine explorers on this island in the 16th century, what it was like when indigenous folks were there, but also to imagine, in the decade that cartels were keeping everyone out, what was actually going on in this island. Nobody really knows, they weren't allowing people on it. So to go the transition from, smuggling drugs into South Florida and having Dobermans and armed men with machine guns to a Disney cruise ship rolling up, what a fascinating turn of events, right?
Exactly. So I haven't read this book yet, but Jim Korkis just came out with a Disney Cruise Line book.
Okay.
And he always he's got an amazing mind. He's a collector of stories, and how he remembers them all, I'm not exactly sure, but I just got the book in the mail, so I'll be kind of fascinated to see, because I know there's a lot of Disney's put a lot of like little touches and hints there from what they actually filmed Splash on the island. There's the famous scene with now I can't see it, Daryl Hannah, on the beach with Tom Hanks, and so they've put some homages to that.
Interestingly, the Splash movie was filmed in 1984. The drug bust happens in 1983. Right, so it maybe very quickly became a place that, again, was deserted and no longer taken over by cartels. And one of the Pirates of the Caribbean movies, was it the man with the bearded?
I don't remember which one. I saw the first two, and then I never saw the rest of them.
Yeah, well, a portion of it at least was filmed there. But I'd be quite interested to hear if there's any listeners that have like additional information, or any historians that could, pull more out from it. I'm sure there are villagers in Abaco, and that have more information and stories about it. But of course now, they no longer frequent the island. Of course, no randoms, no pirates, no fishermen showing up that we know of. I don't know, since it hasn't had any tourists on it, we never know what's going on over there. But
and there is that plane too that's hidden in the jungle. I always kind of wonder where they got that from.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't think it was a relic of the island necessarily. I think they just were theming. They were like, what do we do with this landing strip? Well, let's just run a bunch of people on the most humid place on earth for 5K.
We got to give them something to look at, right?
You got to give them something to look at aside from the golf carts that almost run you over sometimes. People headed over to the cabanas. And like if you have headphones in when you're doing the 5K, you got to watch out. There's a lot of vehicles going up and down that landing strip.
Well, anything that we didn't touch on tonight, Steve, that
I don't think so.
That was worth throwing out there.
I definitely think that there's people out there that are going to be like, maybe that's not right. But I tried. I didn't want to take a lot of information. I was like, there's information out there like in the 1930s that there was bootleggers on the island and stuff, but that was alcohol being smuggled through there. But that doesn't really make a whole lot of sense to me, and I wasn't able to really confirm that in any way. Yeah, I think we covered a lot of it. I absolutely recommend this article. Maybe you can share it on Facebook page or something like that. I'll send it over to you. And maybe we can have a follow-up and actually get someone's perspective of what it was like to just go there before it was developed. Because I don't even know who else would have information like that, right?
Right. Well, why don't you just share it? I'll put it in the show notes too. But what year, or it was 1999, you said the article came out in Outside Magazine?
Yeah. But the gentleman's name is Robert Antoni, Antoni.
So go to 1999, Robert Antoni. If you want to go back and probably do a Google search, you might be able to find that article there. I'll try and put a link in the show notes as well for anybody that wants to try and find it that way. If I can find it.
Yeah, I will. I should have gotten it over to you before the episode, but I've been entrenched in all my research over here.
Stuff like this just totally fascinates me.
Mm-hmm.
The history of different places. I mean, it's one of the things that I've really wanted to do when I first started this podcast, was really to talk about the different ports and the history behind those ports. And that takes a lot of work, to be completely honest, to do that. So,
yeah, it does. And look, you can understand why, Disney doesn't exactly, not that they, actively suppress this information, but when you get to the island, you hear the local on the voiceover on the tram to your destination. You don't want to also hear And also, this was formerly a place where lots of cocaine came through. Hey, Mickey Mouse, like that's not exactly what they're trying to do. So they don't, I think they try to celebrate the culture. I think they try to hire and have locals on that island. I think obviously they have the merch shop there with the Bohemian that the Bohemian government collects revenue on and perhaps taxes. There's the post office. So I think that, they try to keep it as serene and honest as it can be, but certainly not shouting out the prior usage on the island. I don't think you're going to get anybody inside the company confirming that story. I just wonder, Steph, when they were developing it, what they found, what was there. Because like I said, he references in the 1950s that there was treasure left by the Spanish from the 16th century on the island. I mean, what did they find? Yeah, and so much of it is, again, undeveloped and unexplored. So very, very interesting. Maybe we'll have a couple chapters of this story we can see we can dig up. I feel like an investigative journalist.
Definitely. Well, once the ship starts sailing, you go back to Castaway Cay. Don't go outside of the boundaries looking for. We're definitely not professing that. Looking for pirates' gold, because it might be a fool's errand.
I believe so. Yes, just sweat your way up and down the runway, or take a bike. I think the bikes are actually a lot of fun if you don't want to run. Take a bike to explore. You get a little sense at the end of the bike tour. I don't think you've done that, Steve, but as you go down the path, you'll get a little bit more sense of a big panoramic of at least that western side of the island where the beaches are. So you kind of are like, oh, this is a much larger place than you think. So if you're just getting off the boat, going to the family beaches, you don't really get a sense of how big that place is. So go to Lookout Tower, take the bikes out, and you'll get a little sense. And maybe you can imagine Frank Barber sending his supply out into Miami in the late 70s.
Well, I guess as we kind of finish up, I want to reiterate once again that, we're just amateur historians here and just passing on information. I really appreciate the time that you took to dive into this and to talk about this. If anybody out there knows something different, we'd love to hear it. And we'll definitely pass it on in a future episode and get it out through Facebook and everywhere we can, so that we can stand corrected if somebody knows something different than we know.
Yeah, please do. I'm sure not all of this is, spot on accurate, but tried to do our best.
Right. Well, as we get out of here today, I guess, what's next for you guys, Steve? The early 2022 sailings came out. Did you book anything, or was there anything that intrigued you?
I haven't. I've gone back and forth about this, and there's a bunch of stuff, like personally I want to take care of in the house, and I'm like, okay, I can't make this big purchase yet. Let me see if my wife will get on board. But, the closer you get to Christmas time and, the more we start to explore, maybe we'll find something in the near future. None of us really know what the heck it's going to look like going forward at the moment. So I just want to see what it's going to look like. And unfortunately, it's been almost a year since our last one. I know that's not a long time, but it feels like a long time to us. I've been on 8 of these things. So I don't know. Hopefully I have something fun to talk about. We toyed around with the idea of New Orleans. Obviously, Hawaii looks awesome. I still think I want to wait till my kids are a little older. So maybe we'll get it. We've done so many Caribbean cruises. Maybe we'll get outside of our comfort zone. So you got stuff coming though, right?
Yeah, we've got a bunch booked, but like you said, in a lot of ways, it's kind of waiting to see A, when it actually happens, and B, what it looks like. And I think what's nice about you guys living in Florida is you might have some opportunities to get on some pretty cheap sailings. If it looks good, you guys feel safe going, and they finally get sailing, because there might be some openings down there for you guys to do a pretty good deal on some of these sailings coming up once they start.
Yeah, I hope they can, and I hope they can safely. I don't want to be the one to try to figure that out, but I definitely hope they can for everybody. And most importantly, I think the ports and the people jobs that rely on, this, and, the folks that really would like to go. We just have the opportunity to kind of look from a distance to see what it's going to be like. But eventually, when you strip down the experience to a certain point, you got to assess whether or not it's going to be valuable to you, because of course, especially you've been on, I've been on, so we know what it looks like under quote unquote normal kind of conditions. So you got to make that decision. But we'll see here. I try not to even think about it anymore. I hate even taxing my mind trying to think like, what is this going to look like? When is it going to happen?
You're in the same boat as the rest of us, I think. Well, I guess as we kind of get out of here, once again, thanks, Steve, for diving deep into a little bit of history of Gordy Key, Castaway Cay. I hope all you listeners out there enjoyed this kind of look at some of the history that we've been able to delve up, especially Steve's been able to delve up. And once again, if you guys have any input or any questions about this or know something different than we do, we'd love to hear it from you.
Absolutely. That was fun.
All right. Well, as we get out of here, all the best to you and your family down there, and we will talk to you soon, Steve.
Thank you. Talk to you soon.
Well, that's going to wrap up our first show. Once again, I really want to thank Steve for being part of this project with me and helping me kind of tell the story behind Gordy Key and cruising through history. And I hope you're really going to enjoy this short series as we continue to take a look at the history of cruising. Once again, if you have any differences in what we've talked about or things that we need to note or make changes of, you can reach out to me, steve@dclpodcast.com, and we'll make sure that we correct anything that needs to be corrected in future episodes. Well, between now and our next show, if you have the chance to do so, we sure would appreciate it if you go over to iTunes and leave us a review. That helps us get a little bit more known in the cruising, the Disney cruising, and just travel industry in general on the podcast field. We appreciate each and every one of you that take the time to do that. So between now and our next show, on behalf of myself, Steve, and also Christy and Chris, all of us here at the DCL Podcast, we'd like to thank you for coming back and taking a listen, and we wish you and your families be well, and we'll see you next time on the DCL Podcast. The DCL Podcast is not affiliated with the Disney Cruise Line, Walt Disney Company, Adventures by Disney, or Run Disney. All of the opinions expressed on our shows are those of the hosts and the guests who appear on the show. If you have any questions about any of these products, please contact the Walt Disney Company.